Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome all of you to Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center's Lakin Lecture Series. I am Lori Shepard, Executive Director, and on behalf of myself and our Board of Directors and the staff of Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center, we want to thank all of you for taking the time to be with us here tonight. Whether you are here in person or you happen to be out there on the live stream, we are happy that you are with us. Tonight is the opening of the 2024-2025 four-part Lakin Lecture series on anti-Semitism, and we are so grateful to all of those who have helped make this series happen. This work would simply not be possible without our organizational partners at Jewish Philanthropies of Southern Arizona and the team here at the J, as well as individual donors such as Michael and Marcia Zakaria. And of course, we have one very special donor whose support and vision have been with us every step of the way. This individual established the Ed and Alma Lakin Education Fund, a Jewish Community Foundation of Southern Arizona, to honor her parents, Alma and Eddie, and their lifelong commitment to Holocaust education, the people of Israel, to Jewish life, and to combating anti-Semitism. At Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center, we know that this annual series is an amazing way to continue to honor their legacy. Just as Ed and Alma did in their own lives through their advocacy and social justice work, this series continues to tackle tough topics, the ones that weigh heavily on this community's hearts and minds. As you know, this year's series of lectures will be exploring the through line of anti-Semitism in so many aspects of our daily lives. Beginning this evening and continuing over the next few months, we will be examining the intersectionality of anti-Semitism with threats to democracy, issues of free speech and protest on college campuses, coalition building with the broader community, and how we face race in our country today. Now, I said this when we kicked off last year's series, and it bears repeating. I think that we all come together tonight knowing that these presentations and lectures that follow will not end anti-Semitism. But we are confident because we have seen it in action that these will help educate us and help empower us, both as Jews and Jewish allies alike. These lectures and the important work that followed them will continue to give us a framework, point of reference for the work that each of us are doing in our own daily lives to both combat anti-Semitism and other forms of identity-based hate. Because the goal of this series is not merely to point out the challenges that we face, but to actually equip us with the tools that we need to fight those challenges together. And tonight, I cannot think of anyone better to help us kick off this year's series than our amazing first speaker. So I would like to invite our very own community JCRC director, Lynn Davis, to share a few words and to introduce him to all of you.
Good evening, everyone. As Lori said, my name is Lynn Davis, and I am director of the Tucson, no, I'm not. I'm director of the JCRC, Jewish Community Relations Council for Tucson and Southern Arizona. I'm going to go off script for just a moment because I think Lori mentioned two very important things, that these lectures, this series may not solve anti-Semitism, and that she invited us to look at them as a framework. And so I hope everyone will take this opportunity to think of tonight's lecture and the lectures that follow as a jumping off point. And how are we going to carry this information out into our community, this education, these new connections, these relationships? And I think that's a big part of the work as well. And now I'm going to pretend I'm a millennial and do this off my phone. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Rabbi Jonah Pesner to Tucson. Rabbi Pesner serves as the director of the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism and also senior vice president of the Union for Reform Judaism, positions that he's held for over a decade. Over the course of his career, Rabbi Pesner has led and supported campaigns for racial justice, economic opportunity, immigration reform, LGBTQ plus equality, human rights, and a variety of other causes. He is dedicated to building bridges to collectively confront anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other forms of hate, and importantly, encouraging Jewish communities to reach across lines of race, class, and faith while campaigning for social justice. Rabbi Pesner serves as a board member of the NAACP, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, Civil and Human Rights, the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, and the New England Center for Children. He is a member of the Faith-Based Security Advisory Council for the Department of Homeland Security, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation Solidarity Council on Racial Equity, and the leadership team of the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. You'll see why I needed notes. And this isn't all of it. There's more, but you can go, named one of the most influential rabbis in America by Newsweek magazine, he is an inspirational leader and tireless advocate for social justice. Rabbi Pesner is married to Dana Gershon, social justice warrior in her own right, and also an attorney. They have 4 daughters. So please join me in welcoming Rabbi Jonah Pesner to the stage.
Good evening. Thank you for that amazing introduction. I loved it, Lynn. I wrote it. So I must admit, it's got that great reference to that, wonderful, incredible weekly magazine you all read every week, Newsweek, right? So what happens when you get called one of the most influential rabbis in America by a publication that goes out of business? I don't know. It's still online, I think. Do we read Newsweek online? All right, so it could be worse. I am so filled with gratitude, first of all, to the Lakin family and to honor the memory of these incredible leaders who kept the spirit of Judaism alive despite the Holocaust and then have helped amplify the lessons of the worst catastrophe for the Jewish people in this era, to be able to be about human rights and social justice for all people and to beat back anti-Semitism. Thank you for that. And it's an honor to kick off this lecture series. I know 2 of the speakers who are coming personally, Eric Ward and Amy Spitalnik, and I can confidently say you should come back because they're much better than me. You will love them. Lori and Lynn and Martin, who is somewhere, and your colleague Uri at the museum, I love you. You're the new family I didn't know I had in Tucson. And it's been, thank you. You should celebrate. This museum, and by the way, we were a little bit late tonight because I did actually get to go see the museum, and it's an amazing juxtaposition. You have the actual story of the Jewish people, the synagogue, its sacred artifacts, the Torah, the source of our joy and inspiration, juxtaposed with the reality of the Holocaust. And we live in both the place of celebrating Jewish life and Jewish vitality despite 5,000 years of history and the challenges that that history has brought. And so thank you to the museum. To Todd and his team here. Where's Todd from the JCC? Thank you, and your team. Hava, I know we're going to have a chance to dialogue a little bit later. I'm a little bit nervous, folks. I got to be honest. I'm going to be looking at you, okay? And no offense to people online, I'll try and look at you too, but I'm not looking over there because this is the peanut gallery. We have 3 rabbis, my colleagues in the Reform movement, okay? Tom Lockheim is here somewhere. Norman Roman is here. Sandy Seltzer is here. These are 3 of the great, what we call Gidolei Hador, great rabbis of the generation, who were some of the kinds of rabbis that inspired rabbis like me to become rabbis. So in all seriousness, you can celebrate them. Thank you. And it really is, and I'm gonna actually talk in a minute. I'm gonna share like a few minutes of my personal narrative, how I got here, because I think it will help people understand the perspective that I bring to anti-Semitism. So the final acknowledgement I want to make is the Levy family is here. Where are you, Levies? Who grew up with me on 10th Street and University Place in Lower Manhattan at the Village Temple, and are here tonight. We haven't seen each other in, I think, maybe 50, 40 something years. So nice to see you. Thank you for coming tonight. And you're in my story. So I'm gonna just share a bit of like who I am and how I got here. So my dad was the president of the Village Temple. It was a wonderful little Reform synagogue in Lower Manhattan. My mom was also on the board. There weren't a lot of us young people. I think I was in the first kindergarten class. It was like the kind of temple that the board would meet around the dining room table of my parents' not so large apartment kitchen table, and would have debates about whether to renew the rabbi's contract or whether they could afford to have a youth group or not. And I say all of this because this was the institution growing up in the 1970s in Lower Manhattan that inspired and nurtured and took care of me. The rabbi used to famously say that the Pesner family was the first family that hosted him for Shabbat, and that would fill me with pride. And I say all of this because when I was entering high school, my father, of blessed memory, suddenly died. And the village temple and the Hebrew school teachers and the rabbi and the youth group advisors surrounded my mother and my brother and me with love and support and literally saved my spiritual life. I became a rabbi because the way those young rabbis and rabbinical students and Hebrew school teachers took me to Jewish summer camp, took me to Nifty in Israel, took me to Washington to go visit the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, which I now have the incredible honor 40 years later to actually lead, and shaped my spiritual life. But something else happened as well. My mother became a single working mother. We lived in affordable housing, a rent-control apartment. I went to the very best public school in New York, watch it, Levy family, the Bronx High School of Science. For any expat New Yorkers like the Levys over here, okay? So what might you think the best public high school in Lower Manhattan is? Stuyvesant, yeah. Okay, that would have been very convenient. I would have gotten up in the morning, and walked a few blocks and gone to where my older brother got in, but I didn't get in. I like to say God had other plans for me. God put me on the number 4 subway train every morning through some of the richest neighborhoods in the Western world and through some of the poorest and most devastated neighborhoods in the Western world. Because if those of you that know the geography of Manhattan, this is the 70s into the 80s, you'd get on and the Midtown was all the corporate execs coming and going. 86th Street, Upper East Side, all the white people would get off. And then you'd be up into Harlem and Spanish Harlem. And then the train would come up at the South Bronx, Yankee Stadium, the most devastated, neglected neighborhood in the history of this, my imagination. And that shaped me because I would hear the incredible social justice messages of my rabbis and my youth leaders who taught me that to be a Jew was to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with God. They taught me that to be a Jew was to be concerned with the most vulnerable, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. It was the rabbis who taught me that 36 different times, 36 different ways, the Torah repeats, you should love the stranger as you love yourself. Maybe because it's 36 times more difficult than loving your neighbor as you love yourself, which it only says one time. And then I saw the radical poverty, suffering, and inequity of the South Bronx. So here I was holding the tension of having been saved by and loved by the Jewish people. I loved Judaism. I loved Torah. I loved my youth weekends. I loved singing with the guitar, the Hebrew songs, Havdalah. I loved Shabbat and Shabbat dinner. I loved the challah every Friday night. I loved learning from my incredible young rabbinical leaders about the brilliance of Torah. And I was deeply agitated by the reality of the suffering of the South Bronx. And so I hold internally the dialectic and what is, at this moment in American Jewish history, a false dialectic between Jewish peoplehood over here, loving Judaism and loving Jews, and universalism and being for others and the poor and for all of humanity over there. For me, they were deeply intertwined and intersected. And it set me on a journey to be the kind of rabbi who would be as concerned about protecting the Jewish community, building a Jewish future, engaging and inspiring the Jewish young people to become Jews, as I would about challenging my Jewish people to show up in the South Bronx and say, Hinenu, we're here, we care. Sometime later, I had the great honor of being inspired and mentored by a Lutheran minister named John Heinemeier. John actually challenged me about why I cared so much about Judaism and about justice. And I shared with him the story about growing up at the South Bronx. And he invited me to bring a group of donors and a group of rabbis to the South Bronx to see how it had transformed in the years since I had been there. And I was blown away by Nehemiah Affordable Homes, tens of thousands of owner-occupied units of housing, neighborhoods now that have replaced the devastation of the South Bronx of the 70s with gardens and playgrounds and owner-occupied homes. Nehemiah, and why was it called Nehemiah? Because our prophet, Nehemiah, rebuilt the walls in the city of Jerusalem. Nehemiah was a project of the churches and the synagogues of New York City that gathered and organized together to electively transform the South Bronx. And I said to Reverend Heinemeier, you are the kind of rabbi that I need to be. That is what got me on the journey to be where I am now, a rabbi who thinks deeply about Jewish continuity and the Jewish future, serves the Jewish people, and challenges the Jewish people to reach beyond themselves. That's how I got here. I want to name for a second how we collectively got here. I want to take everyone, ask you to think for just a second, just as I did a minute ago, to share a story about the people who inspired me, the rabbis who challenged me, the pastor, the minister who challenged me and inspired me to be the kind of Jew that I am now. I imagine you have those people in your own lives who have shaped you, why you came here tonight, why you care deeply about anti-Semitism and protecting the Jewish people, but also probably have wider concerns about democracy, which is in the balance, about humanity, which is on the ballot in the upcoming election. Think about for a second your own personal story of why and who the people are who got you here. So in getting to the more global story about anti-Semitism and where we are, I want to share another story about another incredible Jewish leader who helped all of us collectively get where we are today as the American Jewish community. How many of you have heard the name Kivi Kaplan? Raise your hand high. Sandy, you don't count. Norm, you count. That's okay. How many of you have never heard the name Kivi Kaplan? Tom, I know you know. Okay, great. So you'll forgive me for those that know Kivi. Is it worth telling the story? I think it's worth telling a story. Because I wouldn't be here, certainly, and many of us might not be here in the way that we are if it hadn't been for people like Kivi Kaplan. So Kivi, like many, was the descendant of immigrants from Russia and the old country who came here with nothing, built a life, built a business, became incredibly successful, and then incredibly philanthropic. And Kivi was a beloved member of Temple Israel in Boston, where I used to be a rabbi as well many years later. But his philanthropy and his activism was shaped by the seminal experience that he and his beloved wife, Emily, experienced on their honeymoon to, Pava, forgive me, South Florida. It was a different era, although Kivi and Emily went down to South Florida for their honeymoon. It was a different era. It was during the Jim Crow era. And they were being driven around by a taxi driver. And everywhere they went, they kept seeing the same sign over and over again. No Jews, no dogs. No Jews, no dogs. The taxi driver that was driving them around, interestingly enough, was black. Kivi turned to the taxi driver famously and said, "What is this? Is this common down here?" And the black taxi driver looked at Kivi and said, "They don't even bother with us. They don't even bother with us." Kivi was so deeply agitated that his philanthropic priority became funding Jewish community that he loved and the civil rights movement. He became very active in the NAACP. And for those that don't know, he was the last white Jewish president of the NAACP, which in its origin was a coalition of mostly white Jews and black Christians. There are exceptions to that, and I invoke the name of Charles McDew, who was one of the leaders of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who was a black Jew. So we have a nostalgia when we see the pictures of the civil rights era of black people and white people who are Jewish. There were exceptions to that. So I forgive me. And I also want to lean into what Kivi understood, which was that Dr. King was teaching. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That if you oppress one group, you oppress all groups. And the only way to respond is through solidarity and through relationship. So Kivi, in addition to becoming at the highest echelons at the NAACP, bought an embassy-sized building on DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., and gave it to the Jewish people. He gifted it to the Reformed Jewish movement, to the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. And by the way, I see my friends Simon and Louise Rosenblatt, who are former trustees of the UAHC or the URJ, the Reformed Jewish Movement, of which Kivi was also a member of the Board of Trustees. He gifted the building to our movement under one condition, that we were to be a hub for the civil rights movement. And our first director, Rabbi Dick Hirsch, heard the call from Kivi Kaplan, came into the building, and his first act as leader of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism was to call his dear friend, a young charismatic preacher, and said, "Martin, good news. Now you have an office in Washington." And so it was that when Dr. King would come to DC, he would use our offices. The Leadership Conference for Civil Rights, of which I proudly sit on the board, and why I'm also on the board of the NAA, hosted the Leadership Conference and the luminaries, which is why the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were drafted in our conference room. How many of you knew that factoid of American Jewish history? What an incredible story about interfaith, multiracial solidarity. Because they understood something that I have been repeating over and over again. Our safety as Jews comes from our solidarity with others. Kivi understood when he saw the sign, "No Jews, no dogs." And here was a Black driver who was erased even from that bigotry, that Jewish people would never be safe in America unless all people were safe. And hear me now, it wasn't just a kumbaya get together and have interfaith multiracial solidarity. It was a fight for civil rights, the crowning achievement of which was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, because Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner understood that people's voices are only heard when their votes are actually counted. They understood that to actualize a vision of a multiracial, inclusive society in which everybody can thrive would be a democracy in which everybody actually had full participation. And think about the history of American civilization. It has always been a journey and a fight in the democracy that has so many times excluded so many people. I'm looking at half the room, more than half the room. And here we are in this ongoing fight for civil rights and social justice. I say all of that because the lecture is titled Antisemitism, but I'm inspired, and the reason we call the lecture Antisemitism and Democracy is because I'm inspired by Kivi Kaplan, who understood that the way to realize a world in which Jews thrive was to build on the interfaith multiracial relationship so we know each other, we love each other, we hear one another, amen, and together we create the kind of democracy in which all of us thrive. And by the way, this wasn't something Kivi Kaplan made up. He learned it from his tradition. Everybody say Shifra. Everybody say Pua. How many of you know who Shifra and Pua were? How many of you have no idea what I'm talking about? Okay. Once again, you're going to go home and you're like, wow, that Jonah guy, he can go back to DC, but I'm going to remember Kivi Kaplan, Emily Kaplan, and Shifra Pua. These are great people to know. Shifra and Pua were the Hebrew midwives. They were the ones who, when the first time in our history, because the Holocaust wasn't the last, there was an attempted genocide against the Jewish people. You'll remember the story, you tell it every year at your Passover Seders, right? Pharaoh went and said, take all of the Hebrew boys and cast them into the Nile. Murder them. That's genocide. And the Hebrew midwives, Shifra and Pua, they resisted Pharaoh. Now, I want to just, anybody in the labor movement here, anybody kind of work with, midwives back in ancient Egypt? How powerful a block was that, do you think? Right? I'm picturing some kind of, healthcare assistants, nursing care workers, midwives, women. Pharaoh, lots of power. The midwives, but when Pharaoh went and told them to do this, they came back to him, two of them, and said, the Hebrew women, when they birth babies, they're so fast. The babies are born and gone before we have a chance to throw them in the river and drown them. And then the text tells us Pharaoh moved on. They succeeded. They won. By the way, there are lots of rabbinic commentaries about it. You know the story? People, is it sounding familiar now? Two really interesting tidbits about that story. One is, why were there two of them? Why was it just Shifra or Pua? What does that teach us? The power of solidarity. They were strong together. Goodman, Cheney, Schwerner together. Shifra, Pua together. They found strength and resilience in together saying no to Pharaoh. And Rashi, the most famous biblical commentator in history, asked the question, were they Hebrew midwives or were they midwives to the Hebrews? If they were actually midwives to the Hebrews, what does that tell you? They were Egyptian allies. Rashi is telling you something. He's got a flashing light on, saying, pay attention, because our safety is in our solidarity. It's Shifra and Puah, the righteous, non-Jewish, non-Hebrew midwives, who are just the midwives to our people who will take care of us. And by the way, the conspiracy continues. By the way, conspiracy can be a very bad word. It can also be a really good word. I was reminded this morning at breakfast, the root of conspire is to breathe together. God only created humans by giving us breath. To breathe together is to bring life. The midwives were life givers. Genocide, Pharaoh's evil, the Holocaust, was about destroying life. Pharaoh takes the role of God. Talk about idolatry. And Shifra and Puah say, no, we are life givers. We breathe. We bring life. We bring breath. And it continues because Miriam and Yocheved rescue that one little boy and put him in a basket to save the Jewish future. His name was Moses, you know the story. And who rescued him? Pharaoh's daughter. Talk about interfaith solidarity. Pharaoh's own daughter. Together, they organized and they showed the way to keep Jews safe was to have a solidarity movement to resist the genocidal decree. And by the way, we read this story over and over again at our Passover Seder. And people ask me, Rabbi, why do you think Jewish people care so deeply about social justice? Why are Jews always in these interfaith, multiracial coalitions for justice? Why were we on the front lines of the civil rights movement? Why do we work so hard for LGBTQ equality? Why are we part of the women's movement? And I say to myself, if every year we gather with our family and friends, and the number one thing, by the way, and this is data driven, the number one thing that most Jews do, and a lot of non-Jews too, by the way, whether they go to Shabbat or they go to high holidays or they go to the JCC, they do what? They go to a Seder. How many of you will be at a Seder this year? Okay, I'll tell you. Side note, I like to host Seders. I have all kinds of interesting people. I've had the president of the NAACP. I've had, Catholic bishops. I always have people at my Seder, and you should do the same. It's a lot of fun. So I had the former governor of Massachusetts, Deval Patrick, who is a wonderful, incredible leader and a Menschie guy. And we're doing the Seder, and I'm doing that thing, maybe some of you have done this before. I'm explaining everything. This is the part where we're going to take the matzah and we're going to break it in half. And I'm talking too loud, too, to make sure people understand. And Deval looks at me and says, Jonah, you think it's my first Seder? But if every year we gather and the number one thing we do is say, we were slaves in Egypt. We were oppressed. And then we rose up and experienced freedom. And therefore, read the text, we should love the stranger. We should have radical empathy. We should see the other person, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the poor, as if we ourselves, remember the text is very clear, we're commanded that on that day we are to see ourselves as if we ourselves came out of Egypt. That is about radical empathy. So to me, anti-Semitism, understanding those moments in history, whether it was the destruction of the temple, the genocidal decree of Pharaoh, the Holocaust, or some of the horrors that we're seeing right now, drives me to go even deeper into radical empathy, to love the other, to then be loved by the other. Am I making sense? Okay. Another side note of history, because you can't make this stuff up. That first director, Rabbi Dick Hirsch, built the Reform Jewish presence in Washington. He invited Dr. King, and then he went and he marched with King in Selma. Dick Hirsch, after building out this relationship between the Jewish community and the civil rights community, sometime later actually made Aliyah to Israel and built the Reform Jewish movement in Israel. It's called the IMPJ, the Israel Movement for Progressive Judaism. and was one of the founders of the IRAC, the Israel Religious Action Center, which is the sister organization to my own RAC. And the IRAC similarly advocates for human rights, social justice, and challenges Israel to be the Israel that we can be proud of. As a Zionist, as a person who believes in Jewish defense and a Jewish state. In fact, his memory for blessing, we only lost Rabbi Hirsch a year and a half ago. Rabbi Hirsch used to famously say, Zionism is a social justice ideology. We're at a moment in history in which, on the one hand, Zionism has been co-opted by many people who see it strictly as a Jewish defense no matter what strategy, and is being defined by anti-Zionists similarly as some kind of horror, racist, supremacist colonial thing that is not what Echad Ha'am or Martin Buber or Abraham Joshua Heschel, who also marched with Dr. King and Selma, taught. They looked at our prophets. Isaiah, who clearly said, God put us, the Jewish people on this earth, to be what? An or lagoyim, a light unto the nations. Echad Ha'am taught in his Zionism that meant if there were a Jewish state, it would be for the liberation of all Jewish people to live freely in their ancestral land and for all people to live freely in their lands, including the Palestinian people. A vision of social justice and equity for all people living everywhere. That was the Zionist ideal that came out of the same person who marched with Dr. King and Selma, who also marched for the rights of all humans living in the land of Israel. I say all of that right now because we're at this incredible and unprecedented time where so much is getting conflated. And for many of us, I had a rabbi in Los Angeles who has been at the front lines of so many social justice causes, who said to me, I feel like I have been, I'm now sort of an outlier in coalitions of which I've had historic relationships, and I'm being welcomed into coalitions I don't want to be a part of. It's a very confusing time to be a Jew. Am I right? Let me put that in historical context. How we do? Are people okay? Can I keep going a little bit longer? You got some energy? Okay, good. Oh my goodness. I've been at the, yeah, okay. You got energy? You're good. Okay. So I took over the RAC, the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, 10 years ago. By the way, my first time there was as part of that time back at the Village Temple, 14 years old. My youth group advisor, Barney Brickner, tapped me on the shoulder and said, do you want to bring the youth group down to Washington? And I said, I don't know, will there be girls there? And it was like, sure. So we had an amazing time. Yes, there were girls there. I married Dana. It is true. We went to Israel together, went to camp together. It's all good. We both wanted to grow up and be the person we met, Rabbi David Saperstein, who was the director of the Religious Action Center for 40 years between Dick Hirsch and me. And he opened up our eyes to a Judaism that was a Judaism about Torah, text, and tradition. And then you study it and learn it and take it down to Capitol Hill and raise your voice for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, which is what the Religious Action Center has been doing for the 60 plus years since Rabbi Dick Hirsch was the founder. We've been on the front lines of every important social justice fight in American history. And it was my life dream to become David Saperstein, and 10 years ago it happened. In 2015, I was nominated to become the head of it because Rabbi Saperstein was appointed an ambassador for international religious freedom by President Obama, and he moved off the RAC stage, and this, kind of happy young rabbi comes to Washington, and I'm sitting in my office, and there is a plaque that says it was in this spot that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was written and the Voting Rights Act. And I thought to myself, what am I going to do? Things are so good. Obama was president, things seemed like they were going in a certain kind of direction. And I was like, I don't know, it's kind of, I don't know, I'm not sure what's going to happen. In fact, I was invited that year, 1 or 2 months after I started, was the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, right? The march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And I was invited to come lead the Jewish delegation to the commemoration. And you may remember that year, President Obama led this march with John Lewis. It was an incredible array. And I was great. This will be a great way for me to kind of do a first thing. I'll show up. There were 1,000 people there, all the luminaries of the civil rights era, all of the greats and the notables, all the elected officials. It was in Birmingham, Alabama, the night before the march. There was a huge Friday night banquet with thousands of people. I sat in the back because I don't know anything. I don't know anyone. And all of a sudden, I hear from the front of the room, hello, before we start, is Rabbi Pesner here? Rabbi Pesner, all right, could you? And I'm like, oh my God, I'm already in trouble. I've been in the job 7 minutes. So I run down to the front. This Doug Tanner, a great minister, I said, Reverend Tanner, what's wrong? He said, well, Rabbi, we realize it's Friday night, it's Shabbat. You should say a blessing. Rabbi says, this happened to you? Yeah. So I had no, who knew? So I get up at the microphone. I see all these people. I mean, truly, I was humbled by and I was like, what am I going to say? And I realized it wasn't about me. It was not about me. So I introduced myself, but I explained that I was the head of the Religious Action Center. I told the Kivi Kaplan story. I reminded people about the Voting Rights Act and the conference room. I reminded them about the relationship. I invited all of the Jews who were in the room to come stand with me. And they all came up, by the way. It was great. Debbie Wasserman Schultz came up, and Ted was there, all the luminaries. And the senator from Vermont remembered he was a Jew. It was incredible. And I said to the crowd, you see, because Jewish people did not start marching 50 years ago in Selma. We started marching 5,000 years ago out of Egypt. And we're not going to stop marching until everybody is free. And you can tell, please, no applaud, because I finally exhaled. They all applauded. I was like, all right, this is a good first thing. Okay. I go off the stage. I come down, and here, I need a prop. Lynn, come here. And a woman, beautiful, spectacular, grabs my hand and says, Rabbi. I say, Rabbi. Rabbi. And I said, yes, Speaker Pelosi. I'm not making this up. And I was like, thank God I watched CNN and I know what she looks like. I'm like, I'm going to tell her, thank you. Thank you, Lynn, Speaker Pelosi. The sweat is now dripping down and I'm like, okay, now what? And she says, Rabbi. I say, yes, Speaker Pelosi. My granddaughter was Esther on Purim. You must know this story, right? Because Speaker Pelosi's daughter, and I don't know which congregation, is part of one of the congregations in Tucson or Phoenix. I can't remember exactly which one, and was in the Jewish preschool. And Speaker Pelosi had visited during Purim and got to be doing dress up with her granddaughter, who was Queen Esther. And then she looked at me and said, do I count? Do I count? Friends, I want you to think about that for a second. The Speaker of the House of Representatives says to this random rabbi, and she's a practicing Catholic. She is arguably among the most powerful people in America, and looks at a Jew and says, do I count? And I said, if you want in, we'll have you. She was very happy. Think about the lesson around anti-Semitism and how powerful and how well-placed Jews finally are. My grandma Fanny came to New York at 16 with nothing. And I used to tease her, and I would say, Grandma, are you Russian? No, I'm not Russian. I'm Jewish. Grandma, do you speak Russian? No, I don't speak Russian. I speak Jewish. Like, Grandma, I don't understand. You came from Russia. And she said, because your great-grandpa you never met, to dig a hole under the floor of our house so you would have a place to hide when they would come to kidnap the girls, rape the girls, and kidnap the boys. And she said, the rabbi of our town, I saw through the floorboards of our house, have his beard tied behind a horse and dragged to his death. This is why this is why something is different here, and why that room of luminaries who had gathered to march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were about injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, that our safety is in our solidarity, and our redemption can come through democracy. But friends, that was 10 years ago. I couldn't have imagined when I was thinking, wow, how far we've come, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, do I count? It was only 2 years later that we saw tiki torch carrying goons marching around Confederate statue saying Jews will not replace us. Now, you know what I know, but I'm going to say it out loud. A Confederate statue, a symbolism of Jim Crow, a symbol of racial oppression, of racism, and they chant Jews will not replace us. And if you don't, you should know the great replacement lie I will never dignify it with the word theory. The lie that Jewish people have a plot to turn America black, brown, and Muslim by advocating for voting rights and immigration reform, because then we'll bring those people in, we'll allow those people to vote, and Jews are the mastermind of all of it. It is as racist and Islamophobic as it is anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic. And that was all before Tree of Life, where all of that rhetoric, and by the way, the wonderful synagogue in Charlottesville was having Shabbat morning services the morning before this. When we got the call that morning, there were 3 guys outside with AK-47s or assault rifles, whatever these things are, weapons of mass destruction. Just to, it's their right. They can do that because this country is a country that has more guns than people. That is also a statistic since 10 years ago when I took over this job. We now have more guns than people. I am raising my daughters, like many of you, in an era where active shooter drills are normal. And I say this because weapons have always been used as an instrument of both racial oppression and to restrain democracy. These guns keep us from doing what people in a normal society should do: go to school and go to vote. This is the multiracial, inclusive democracy that is at stake. If we care about anti-Semitism, we have to hear Jews do not replace us. We have to know they will come into our synagogues. And by the way, why did the shooter come into the Tree of Life synagogue? Because of the replacement lie. It was Hayas Shabbat, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. I just learned that Rabbi Lakin is going to be working with Hayas around the migrant and refugee crisis. This was a synagogue that had declared itself a solidarity congregation with immigrants and migrants and refugees. And so the shooter came in because he wanted to end this great replacement lie. And. I'll never forget, well, I'll save that for the very end. I'll give you a story about what I saw when I went to Pittsburgh. And because I know our time is getting short, October 7th. And this is why I brought the Zionism and the Israel that many of us and I invoke the hostages and all of those right now who are suffering, and the desperation that we feel to get. And I'm sure some of you have this. I have members of my family who are 1 degree of separation from people who are captive in Gaza right now. I have my goddaughters are in Iron Dome. So for a year, they have been keeping the Jewish people safe, literally by putting their bodies on the front line. And every child in Gaza is my child and your child. And it is a devastation. And any Jew who can't have empathy for the children of Gaza is not walking in the footsteps of 5,000 years of Jewish empathy. And you can definitely applaud for that. And as much as I am petrified by the danger of Hezbollah and their 150,000 weapons of mass destruction on the border of Israel, I also weep for the innocent civilians of Lebanon. Because to be a Jew is to care about Jews and the Jewish future, and to care about Palestinians and the Palestinian future, and the Lebanese and their future, and. We are a both and radical empathy religion. If Dick Hirsch and Shifra and Pua and Miriam and Yocheved and the daughter of Pharaoh and Kivi Kaplan and Emily Kaplan taught us anything, it is to be that. And so October 7th, on the one hand, was the worst assault on Jewish people since the Holocaust. And it's anti-Semitism. How can we call it anything other than it is? We have a nation state in Iran whose organizing principle, believe the words when they say it. And by the way, I say all of this as a social justice activist, okay? Someone who works who toils in the vineyard of interfaith multiracial relations, who survived a Hamas bus bombing in 1995. I lost 3 friends in Jerusalem, Joan Devaney, Matthew Eisenfeld, and Sarah Duker, who were killed on buses by Hamas terrorists. I am not naive about the threat. I understand it. But it calls me to care about peace and a 2-state solution and justice and human rights for all people, including Palestinian people, even more, partly because we will only be safe as Jews with a thriving Jewish democratic state when we actually come to some kind of peaceful, safe solution. And what's been hard about October 7th is the trauma we're experiencing, where on the one hand, we're so petrified and devastated by what's happening in Israel and by the consequence of what's happening to innocent civilians. And the world has decided there is a false up and down binary. You're either for Palestinians or you're not. You're either for Jewish defense or you're not, when we know there is something much more complex happening. And yes, there are pockets of the interfaith multiracial coalitions that we are in that are, let's say it out loud, anti-Semitic. I'll give you a good example. This is all public information. The DC Abortion Fund. This was an abortion fund that was set up in order to help low-income women who did not have access to abortion care to pay for their abortions, not just in DC, but all over the South. A very prominent Jewish member, the only Jewish member of their staff, was horrified when the DC Abortion Fund, which was about a domestic social justice priority to get women reproductive health care, came out very strongly condemning Israel, calling it a genocide in Gaza, and saying with clarity, as if they had some monopoly on righteousness, that to be for reproductive justice is to condemn Israel, condemn Zionism, and condemn what's happening in Gaza. This great Jewish leader left the abortion fund and set up something called the Red Tent Fund because she was not going to give up on her vision that Judaism calls to protect the most vulnerable and to make sure that low-income women would get access to abortion care. Those stories we're hearing all over the place. And as many as we can hear those stories, I can tell you 10 more about interfaith, multiracial conversations and relationships where we actually sit and hear the concerns of our partners and our allies and our networks. And we understand the reality that we're living in, and then make space for us to share what the trauma of October 7th means, and a complex Zionism, a Zionism that makes space for the other, not just for us. The relationships and the coalitions are actually holding. And those relationships are more important now than ever. And with this, I'll come to a close. You folks here in Tucson, you know this, you're at the front line. Because as Jews, if we care about anti-Semitism, we have to care about the ballot initiatives that you're about to vote on. Because the ballot initiatives will impact whether women control their bodies. What happens to migrants and refugees and strangers? By the grace of God, my grandma Fanny, 16 years old, could have been one of the people who would be othered by this ballot initiative. And we know you have a phenomenon in Arizona, a movement, real people organizing around election denialism that are going to do exactly what generations in the spirit of Jim Crow have tried to do, and why Kivy Kaplan and Dick Hirsch and King and the luminaries of the civil rights movement, they understood if we win real voting rights, then we will actually be the multiracial inclusive democracy in which Jews are safe and all people are safe, which is why some people don't want some people to vote. And they're working pretty darn hard. So I urge you to see democracy not as some universalistic issue that is not about Jewish peoplehood. If you care about Jewish peoplehood, you got to care about democracy. And if you care about Israel, you got to care about democracy in Israel. And if you care about the United States, you got to care about democracy in the United States. And if you care about Arizona, if you care about Tucson, you better care about democracy here. Can I get an amen? All right. I'm looking at the clock. You tell me. I have one inspirational closing story, and I have time for questions. So here's my proposal. Why don't we pause, get some questions, and then once we've gotten enough questions, I'll close with the inspirational closing story. Does that sound good? Yeah? All right. And if you need to stretch or you want to walk out in a huff, I won't take it personally, believe me. Many people have walked in my own family. They get up and they walk out. I'm like, what? I'm talking.
I'm going to let you take that one. I'm going to take this one. Okay, so we are going to, first of all, we are being joined by one of our amazing thought partners through all of this. Let me reintroduce, for those of you who don't know, Hava is the president and CEO of Jewish Philanthropies of Southern Arizona. She is going to help us moderate this this portion of our Q&A, and you will see that Lynn, Martin, and Ori are walking around with note cards. So if you would like a note card, if you didn't grab one on the way in, throw your hand up. They will bring you one, and then they'll come back and retrieve that from you. But Hava, I'm going to let you jump in and start.
Thank you so much. And Lori Shepard of the Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center, thank you so much for bringing this fantastic rabbi to our community. I'm still recovering from that very inspirational preach at the end there. Really, really, you are amazing. And something that I can take off the table a little bit, because I've been in Tucson now for about a year. This is a community to your description that carries empathy for all people. I'm not just generalizing, it really is, the vast majority of everybody. So
saw it this morning at breakfast, no doubt.
Wonderful. So I'm going to start where you sort of ended on the 10-7 stuff. So this is a resolution from your organization, the RAC, and I want you to guess the year. You might know, you've been there 10 years. So, but here you go. The RAC has been around for 60 years, correct? Okay. The quality.
Getting nervous. Just stump the rabbi. Here we go.
Quality and conditions of Israel's survival continue to be a source of deep concern. Faced by continued terrorism across her borders, craven political attacks within the United Nations, and serious internal problems, Israel survives and the people of Israel live. We salute the nation's tenacity, her courage, and the forbearance of her people, and we reaffirm our abiding commitment to Israel's destiny.
Oh, I have no idea. I have no idea. So wait, let me give context.
Yeah, go.
So, I mean, people sometimes misunderstand it. They think, oh, wow, Jonah, he's loud and charismatic. He must make this stuff up. I'm actually not allowed to advocate for anything in my public role that has not been grounded in robust policy of the Reform Jewish movement, which is why we have 100 years of resolutions that are passed by the Board of Trustees of the URJ, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, and our biennial conventions of 5,000 people. And so I have to actually understand what our movement's positions are. I don't actually have the luxury of saying like, well, this is how I feel, what I think. So we have probably hundreds of pages of resolutions on Israel, and now I'm dying to know when was that?
So this was from the decade I think we were both born in the 1970s, and I think that what was interesting is that it's very similar to the resolutions of today. So with that, you're very experienced. You're in spaces of intergroup work. Most of us aren't advocates vocally and out loud. Most of our advocacy for the everyday person is one-on-one with the people that we come across. So, you spoke about Shifra and Pua, and you talked a lot about loving the neighbor, loving the stranger, loving the poor. I think most of us understand that. What do we do about love with the person that does not like us, right? The person that doesn't want to engage or believes in the non-normalization of the state of Israel?
It's a great question. And, so I talked about radical empathy, and I also referenced that I lost 3 dear ones to a Hamas terrorist. And so I've often wondered, in the wake of that tragedy in 1995, I did a lot of soul searching in the wake of that. And I imagined that the perpetrator of that massacre didn't understand until the moment he detonated his suicide vest what he was doing. And I say that because that was a way that I could reclaim my humanity and hope that that person, if given the opportunity, might realize the barbaric horror of what he had done. What I think really challenged my theology of empathy and not letting Hamas steal my humanity. And by the way, that's a thing I say to myself all the time. I will not let Hamas steal my humanity. Full stop. October 7th challenged that because they wore GoPros and they raped women and assaulted them over and over again. They cut people's bodily parts off. They did it and recorded it. So they knew what they were doing while they were doing it. So I want to be honest. The lesson of the Holocaust is we should have radical empathy and openness for love for anybody, knowing that there are limits. There are those people who either are so radical and extreme and violent, we should never be expected to sit at the table of those who would murder us. Full stop. But there's a spectrum, because then there's the people who harbor racist or anti-Semitic, deep-seated bigotry. And, there are some amazing stories about people who've spent time in relationship with bigots and helped them kind of humanize. And I don't have time. I honestly, I don't have time. So I really think about a bell curve where at one end of the bell curve are the amen corner who, it's all love, kumbaya, and the other end of the bell curve are the extremes. I'm focused at that group of people in the middle who are open and reasonable and want to be in thoughtful dialogue. And I can only enter that space knowing I have to allow them to move and touch me just as I want to move and touch them. So I actually think it's okay in some of your relationships to say, what, this is not a relationship where I think I'm going to be able to have an impact or be heard, and I'm going to move on. Is that fair?
I'm glad to know you're human. you know?
Yeah, amen. Yeah, that's for sure.
That was really, really important. So while I'm waiting for your questions, I'll throw one more out there. There's this amazing interview on the interwebs in the Google Spaces of you. It's about 10 minutes long, and it's with Al Sharpton, and it's in Politics Now. And he's asking you a whole bunch of questions, and you shared some really incredible information. But one of the things that you talked about was this concept of holding multiple truths. What does that mean today and in the post 10/7 context?
Thank you so much, Hava, for the question. And I actually, without being self-promoting, if you have 10 minutes, watch the Sharpton interview. Particularly for those of you that raised your hands earlier about New York, if you remember Al Sharpton of the 80s, when I do a lot of solidarity work with Sharpton, but the first time he reached out to me, I said, I got to meet with you in person and have a conversation. I said, Reverend Sharpton, I'm a New York Jew. I was in Crown Heights that night. Like I remember. We have to have a conversation, and he absolutely has moved and journeyed in his life from where he was. He won't ever come out and say, I'm sorry I was wrong for a variety of his own political reasons, but he has shown up about anti-Semitism again and again and again. Like after October 7th, he was the most loud and vocal public leading figure of the African-American civil rights movement who spoke out. So there's the irony of that. But in that interview, I was able to help Sharpton and the audience, which skews a very left-wing audience, understand why what was happening on campuses isn't just about a free speech issue. Like if you're, and I have 4 daughters, 3 of whom were in college last year, and I think you have kids in college too, you told me, right? Who are really experiencing what they were experiencing is somewhere between just discomfort about disagreement and violent anti-Semitism. It was pretty bad. And the multiple truths is it's like you can be for Palestine and want there to be actualization of humans living in the Gaza Strip and on the West Bank. And you can be wanting your 19-year-old to have a safe, thriving educational experience. Both of those things can be true at the same time. And I think one of the reasons Jews have struggled over our course of our history is we're the ultimate multiple truths religion. You know, a lot of other world religions are like dogma. You believe this, you believe that. And then Jews are like, well, we believe this. Hillel said it that way, but Shammai actually said it this way, and both are important. What's the answer? Well, I'll tell you a story. Okay, Rabbi. I mean, so that's multiple truths. Like, let's be who we are.
Amazing. We'll get that link out. I'm sure Lori will get that link out to everybody that came today. It's an important interview. This is a question from our attendees today that really represents many questions, and it's about the intersectionality. It's about people, Jewish people who have been fighting for justice in different spaces for different communities for a long time, and are not feeling part of that anymore. And the particular example here is someone who is Jewish and gay and feels an underlying tone of anti-Semitism with their partners or their former partners in that space. And so what are you seeing? What are your thoughts?
Thank you for the question, whoever asked it, and asking it in that way. It's a beautiful question. And many people are experiencing that phenomenon differently. I first of all want to say, as we think about anti-Semitism, as a white, cis, hetero man, I want to acknowledge there's a lot of privilege in my being able to talk about anti-Semitism because I don't suffer from racism. I don't suffer from misogyny. I don't suffer from transphobia. I don't suffer from homophobia. If you're a Black Jew right now, if you're a brown Jew, if you're a gay Jew, if you're a trans Jew, you got other things happening besides just that. So I say to what is a majority white, from what I can tell, community, we need to be thinking about intersectionality, not just from the perspective of like our coalition partners, but like our people, because our trans Jews are really struggling right now, like really struggling. And people ask me, I always introduce myself and say, I'm Jonah. I use the he, him series. And people say to me, why do you have to do that? There's some, you're alienating people. And I say, because I want to keep our kids safe. I have too many friends who are raising trans kids who would contemplate suicide because the world is saying to them, you don't exist. You're not fully human. So to me, it's about keeping our kids safe. So then what do you do when in the trans rights movement, there are people who are like, well, if you're for trans rights, then you are against the genocide in Gaza. It's really hard. It's really hard. I will say a redemptive thing. There's a great organization called Keshet, which is the Jewish LGBTQIA liberatory organization that we are in a deep partnership with. E.D. Klein is the head of it. She's amazing. Keshet worked with Pride communities. This is back in June. I know your Pride is coming up, I think, next week. So you have an opportunity to get with Pride organizers and have conversation with them in advance and say, your Jewish folk are really threatened right now and are petrified that the Pride rallies are going to get turned into weaponization against Israel, against Zionism, against Jews. And they did a lot of training. And actually, Pride went off this year, to what I saw, pretty darn well. And the Pride community kept it together to make sure the Jews felt centered and welcome and safe. So what I'm saying is it is not easy. Like, a lot of us are finding ourselves in those spaces, but that's why we have to do the work. And that's why we can't just be like, oh, I'll just assume this movement I'm part of or these people I'm part of are going to still be there for me. And as I said a moment ago, and then there are people who are going to let you down. And you're going to mourn those relationships. It's very hard. There are relationships with people that I've had historically where I just know we're just not there anymore. And I hope that that'll change, but right now it's okay. It happens.
So would you suggest, like your friend that you described, someone might need to leave and form the red tent, form their own group?
That is not the first choice. You know, the first choice is to call in community and try and be the beloved community that Dr. King talked about. And there are times when, like, and this is all, she wrote an article in Tablet. If people want to see the story of the Red Tent Fund, I urge you to go look. It's kind of a case study of when it all goes south and when things are terrible. But I will also tell you, for every Red Tent story, there are 10 better stories. You know, movements that are really trying to figure out how to, I'll give another example. The specious public debate about DEI is almost as ridiculous as the CRT debate. John Powell from the Othering and Belonging Institute at Berkeley teaches about this brilliantly. He was one of the originators of the equity movement. He's an African-American civil rights veteran. And he talks about, if we're about a community of belonging, then all of us have to be at the table and all of us have to figure out the ways we're complicit with othering. So you can't have a real movement for liberation around reproductive justice if you're saying, well, if you're a Zionist, you're not here because you just othered. The actual test of whether you're building a real inclusive community where everybody belongs is, to what extent are you making sure you're not othering anybody? And even people with privilege and power, and yes, even Jews and Zionists belong. So rather than say, oh, DEI is terrible, that's not the point. The point is, if we strive for a community that is diverse, who doesn't want that? It's what God intended, that is equitable and that is inclusive, then let's work together across lines of difference to create the community belonging where nobody gets othered and everybody belongs. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you. So relationships. So at the end of the day, we keep coming back to these authentic relationships. So this is sort of a rapid fire question. Can you do the SWOT analysis for us? What today, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities? You don't have to answer all of them.
It's a great question.
Threats.
There's some organizer or some Jewish communal professional. What's the SWOT analysis? I have to say, I give talks all the time. I've never been asked, what's the SWOT analysis? I mean, not having thought it through in that framework. So if we were doing a workshop, we'd like really brainstorm as a group.
We'll have you back.
Yeah, or do this. I actually think it'd be great for the Tucson community to kind of do a SWOT analysis and ask ourselves. A question that was asked at breakfast is, where's the Muslim community? It was a gathering at the YMCA or the YWCA. There were Jewish partners, Christian partners, and partners across lines. There were no Muslim partners in the room. I'm told by Rabbi Lakin, there is a robust partnership in the Muslim, Jewish, and Christian community here. I'm an outsider, so I'm telling you what I see nationally. It's really hard with the Muslim and the Jewish communities right now. I mean, when I talk about some of the historic relationships, you know, there are friends of mine who are either imams or leaders in the Muslim community who have really worked hard with me to hear each other and to really stay together. And then there are friends in the Muslim community who right now we just can't talk about it. We just can't talk about it. And unfortunately, one of the weaknesses is not just that, it's social media, because partly so much is playing out on social media. You know, I have an imam I've worked with historically whose social media feed has got millions of followers. Every day, it's another one-sided view of what's happening in Gaza. And the one time it's like, let's have a conversation about like empathy for refugees, empathy for Israel's right to defend itself. Zero empathy. So I'm like, okay, right now there's no empathy. So it's hard, right? So like one of the weaknesses is social media. One of the opportunities, oy.
This is our
what's
opportunity.
the SWOT analysis? You have to explain the SWOT analysis.
In the nonprofit world, probably in the business world too, but people are always doing strategic planning, right? And SWOT analysis is a common framework for doing that planning. So it's something we're always
So here's
about.
the threat. The big
stands
threat
for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats.
I do want to say that right now, those guys with the tiki torches, remember back from Charlottesville? They love this. They love that the Muslim community is pitted against the Jewish community, that the Zionists are being excluded from coalition. That's exactly what they want. It plays right into this kind of neo-Nazi, white supremacist, then they get what they want, which is so where's there the opportunity? You know what? I will do opportunity at the very end with that closing story.
And on the threat, there's a question related to that. We have related to extremism and anti-Semitism, and what are the threats in the U.S. today? For example, is Christian nationalism one of those? What should we be concerned about?
People ask about the challenging. I'm in a coalition around white Christian nationalism, which is a really scary threat. It's like this want to make America a white Christian national state, white read, and there are elements of it that are Zionist. It's really scary because they're like, oh, we believe, that Jews should be in Israel, and there's a whole theology around it. In that coalition, I've had really hard conversations with folks who are like, oh, well, we're the uncommitted for Michigan because Biden, and they call him an epithet that I think I don't want to repeat because it's so obnoxious. And they used it about the governor of Pennsylvania, which I won't repeat. These are the challenging things. So, I think the white Christian nationalist threat is really is right there. And don't underestimate, two things. One is the violence. There are more guns than people. These folks have guns, and I don't know what to do with that. We have a long-term problem of trying to get guns out of people's hands, where we know from Tree of Life, violent rhetoric leads to violent action. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
How do you reconcile welcoming the stranger? And this is related to democracy and the issue of immigration that you discussed during your keynote. Someone mentions here that there is a Reform rabbi in Columbus, Ohio, who has been attacking the Haitian immigrants.
Yeah.
So what do we do? How do we reconcile?
Oh, I really stepped in this one. I think in a good way, but I don't know. You Google it, you'll see. So there, I say that because I almost never publicly critique a colleague. It's just not what I do. I want to bring people together. But unfortunately, and it's all in the press. So look at the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, JTA article about a rabbi who said disparaging things about Haitians and amplified the tropes. He has subsequently apologized. But my team advised me to go public about it because it was so dangerous that a rabbi was representing Judaism as a religion that would normalize what these hateful, bigoted, and by the way, it is likely that my grandchildren will be of Haitian descent, because my daughter, who is amazing, and God forbid she's watching this stream now, I'm in serious trouble because they're not even engaged. Her boyfriend, who is wonderful, came to this country from Haiti when he was 4, and he is this amazing young man doing incredible things. And I'm like, this is personal. This isn't just some political thing. So, I made the decision to publicly, not naming this rabbi, but to publicly present another view. It went viral, it's been all over the place. So I think we all have to think about, when are the times you just call people in privately? How do we, though, sometimes need to have a public conversation to make sure our values are not misrepresented? And that one was a bad one. It really was. And by the way, I had hundreds of rabbis that stepped up to offer to help, who were saying, we don't want to let this rabbi represent us. Who were, willing. We had rabbis at the press conference that would happened in Springfield, Ohio. We had rabbis posting online. We had rabbis speaking. So, the narrative won the day. And I think that's probably why this rabbi apologized. By the way, it's coming to the high holidays. That's why I really didn't want to publicly critique. He should have an opportunity to apologize to Teshuva, and we should accept that and move on. People should have the opportunity to grow and evolve. Please, God.
Yeah, so important, especially in this time of divisiveness and identity politics that has been going on for a long time. So I'm going to ask one more question and then let you tell your story. And this question, I started where you ended, and so I'm ending where you began, which was with Kivi and Kivi's story. And you talked about, one of the things that struck me was how Kibbe
Yep.
is a he.
Usually.
He jumped into the civil rights movement, and I fast forward a little bit from that period of time, and I think about the 70s and 80s when I was much younger and we were kids,
We were all much
and
younger.
then the 90s in college, and it was the time of multiculturalism. It was the time of having centers on campus for multiple faiths, for all different kinds of people. And fast forward to today and our kids and campuses today. Um, and we have separate spaces. We have the Muslim space, we have the Jewish space, we have the safe space for some kids and not other kids. Not, I call them kids, young people, students. Um, so what is different today if a Jewish person wants to support another community, supporting the Black community, for example, to use your example, what is different about the way they can jump in versus the way Kivi did it, or versus the way it was in the 90s?
I'll leave it to someone like a demographer or historian to really answer that question. It's a brilliant question. Because I'm so in the work in the trenches, sometimes it's hard to know. All I can say is when I jumped in, when I did, and we're of the same generational kind of experience, I think it was easier. I think it was easier. I think part of the understanding anti-Semitism at this moment is it's a harder time for Jews to show up in interfaith, multiracial communities to be our whole selves. I think someone like Mark Dollinger, he wrote a great book called Black Power Jewish Politics. It's a great book, and he really reflects on the arc of American Jewish history vis-a-vis race, and has a great chapter at the end about the reality of Black Jews. It's a really brilliant book. But one of the things he talks about is like, what does it mean that while some Jews were marching in Selma in the 50s and into 60s, other Jews were moving out to suburbs with redlining, where they benefited from white privilege and left behind communities of color that didn't. That Israel was founded, and Israel went from being this mighty underdog, David and Goliath type, which is why the quote you read was from the Six Day War. It was when the Reform movement was saying, "Look at Israel, which was this David has now overcome Goliath." There are many critiques of Israel that we act like a Goliath now, and so if you take, white Jewish power, white Jewish privilege, Israel's power, we are seen very differently in the multiracial interfaith coalitions. And so I think it's a lot harder to make a case for Zion, to make a case for Jewish liberation, and to bring our whole selves. And I also think identity politics got a lot more complicated, and not always for the good. Not always for the good. I think I will share the text I shared this morning, Hava, because it's Rosh Hashanah any minute now. We're going to celebrate the creation of the world, and the Midrash is very clear. God created the first human, one human. And why? To teach us that no human could say, well, my ancestor is better than your ancestor. We all came from the same first ancestor. And then the Midrash goes on to suggest that God, when creating that first human, reached out to take earth from all four corners of the world and took yellow clay, white sand, black loam, and red soil to teach us that the multicultural, colorful tapestry of human life was God intended to be. So we have distinction. We're supposed to be different. There's, as Jonathan Sacks famously taught, the dignity of difference. And yet we all want to show up and be one family, one human family. There's a tension there. And I think it got harder to live in that tension.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi. I think we all feel filled up from you today. And I know you had a story that you wanted to close with.
You got time for one more story? I'll make it. So, on a Shabbat morning a few years ago, my phone blew up like many of yours. I don't typically check my phone on Shabbos, but I knew something must be going on. And as the senior ranking member of the Reform Jewish movement, my boss, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, who's our president, was in Israel. The message was get in a car and get to Pittsburgh fast. And it's a 5-hour drive. So I didn't even bring a change of clothes. I just drove to Pittsburgh and got to one of the Reform congregations because we didn't even know at that time what had happened with, full knowledge, but I needed to be there to support, not get in the way, but be in support of the Jewish community of Squirrel Hill. And you all know what happened, but I tell the story because of what I witnessed. It was obviously the worst trauma that we've experienced domestically here, certainly in our lifetime. I mean, a violent attack against Jews praying at worship. And I stayed over, and that next night, it may have been Saturday, I can't remember, the days all went so fast. There was an interfaith solidarity vigil at Soldiers and Sailors Hall. Okay, I don't know if people remember, it was broadcast internationally on television. And the luminaries of Pittsburgh, the city of Pittsburgh, they knew I was visiting, so they gave me a seat of honor, which was very nice. I was like just happy to be there and represent the reform movement. And it was tens of thousands of people. Soldiers and Sailors Hall was so full, there were no seats, people standing in the aisles. They put up a big, like one of these screens outside, and thousands of people were outside in the rain because they wanted to be in solidarity. It was majority not Jewish. It was Black, brown, white, Latino, Asian. It was Muslim, Christian, Jewish, all to be in solidarity. And I witnessed something really interesting that will close us out with democracy and anti-Semitism. The Jewish speakers, of course, were compelling and inspiring and all of that. But Wazi Muhammad, who's a leader in the Muslim community in Pittsburgh, stood up and said, I'm here on behalf of the Muslim community. We have volunteered. We're going to stand outside your synagogues to keep you safe when you're at worship. And we've raised enough money for all of the families who are having hospital bills and funeral costs who are impacted by the Tree of Life. What an act of Muslim-Jewish solidarity. I will say the relationship with Wazi Muhammad since this story has been challenged by Gaza. So this is the reality of what we're working in. So the same Muslim leader who could show such radical empathy, this is a moment where we don't agree on the same set of facts in Israel, but we're in it, okay? But then Dr. Vincent Kolb, one of the most important Black pastors in Pittsburgh, got up at the microphone and closed it out by saying, let me remind you of three things. Number one, this was a violent attack against Jews because they were Jewish, full stop. And when you attack a Jew, you attack all of us, full stop. And then he said, but let's also remember that just a few days ago at a Kroger supermarket, 2 Black people were shot because the church that the shooter wanted to go into was locked. Because after Mother Emanuel, the church shooting in which Black people at worship were killed, churches are now locking their doors. And then he concluded by saying, let's also remember that this congregation was targeted because it was a HIAS refugee solidarity congregation. And here in Pittsburgh, we are a solidarity city. And then something happened that I could not have imagined. This was in October before the midterm elections. People started spontaneously chanting, vote, vote, vote. Because they understood all these things we care about. Getting the guns out of our synagogues, women controlling their bodies, Muslim people and Jewish people being safe, ending the scourge of racism and the fear and the bigotry against the refugee is all hinging on democracy, that our safety is in our solidarity and our redemption will finally come through democracy. Thank you all.
I want to introduce myself. My name is Martin Reichgott. I'm the Director of Philanthropy at the Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center. One thing we always agree, we always appreciate a good lead in, and Keshet is coming all the way from Texas this Sunday for Get Out the Vote Museum. So the flyers are outside, 12 to 2:30 on Sunday. We talked about Keshet, their value. They are coming to the museum this Sunday. We're going to work together to encourage people to get out the vote. Of course, there'll be bagels. So please take a flyer, and we appreciate the lead-in. That was really good. I cannot thank you enough. We are, as a museum, as a Holocaust, as a community, we are truly honored that you would join us for the Lakin Lecture series on anti-Semitism. This is something that we think about every day at the museum. And this is a program that we've established. All we do is literally get excited about how we can do this work. And we have these lecture series, and we have banned books, and we're marching in Interfaith Pride this weekend. And we steward a 114-year-old building when if that building had been razed to the ground, it'd be a lot harder to tell these stories. And honestly, we do it all for free, right? Admission to the museum is free. This lecture tonight is free. And we feel so fortunate to do this work. And all we do is come up with ideas, and not can we do it, how can we do it? And so we need your support in continuing these programs that you have told us. You have told us these are quality programs. And when you think about it, if everybody who is online is here tonight, literally $5 in the month for the next year, we could reach more people in the community with this message, right? Again, not just thinking about what we do now and holding on, but how do we share this message with the work we do every day in Tucson? So you have the rack card right on the seat, right? Ori and Chet are going to have the tablets outside if you feel moved, right? You can go to the website. Just think about this investment. You have to be moved. I'm running through walls for this, Rabbi. And I don't want to talk anymore, I want to act. And we need your help with that. And we really appreciate it. And all we want to do is continue this work. So thank you for being here, and thank you for investing in the future.